Further ado, I would like to introduce our two speakers. First of all, we have Chris Barbuschak and Suzanne LaPierre. They have written a great book called Desegregation in Northern Virginia Libraries, and it's for sale here today. It's also on sale on our online website. So if you are in Zoom land, you can go there to get it. Let me tell you a little bit about our two speakers. Chris is the manager of the Fairfax County Public Library's Virginia Room. He gets paid to do what he loves. Oh, isn't that nice? He loves making Northern Virginia historical records and photographs publicly accessible and assisting researchers with the historical and genealogical quests. He is a graduate in history from Loyola University in Chicago, and he earned a master's in library science from the Dominican University in Illinois. I think that tells us you might be from Illinois.
I'm from here.
You are? Okay, all right. Well, I misread that. He is co-author of another book called, published for the Burke Historical Society called Images of America Burke, much like we have Images of America Arlington. So you're catching up to Arlington. Okay, Suzanne LaPierre is a Virginiana specialist librarian, and she works with Chris in the Fairfax County, Virginia Room. She is pretty prolific. She writes a column for the Wired Library for Public Libraries magazine. The column is called Wired Library. That would be interesting. And she is a contributing writer for recent editions of The Library and Book Trade Almanac. These are apparently trade publications because I have never seen those on any of my shelves. Maybe that will change, though. I'll be looking for your name. You are also a frequent contributor to Computers and Library magazine, and your academic research is published in journals such as the Public Library Quarterly. She earned her master's in library science from the University of South Carolina and has a master's from GW. She has been born in DC, grew up in Maryland, and has lived in Fairfax County for the last 30 years. So I'm happy to welcome you both to the stage as fellow Virginians, fellow Northern Virginians. All right, thank you. And let's have a warm.
I'm Fairfax.
Fairfax, yeah.
Went to Apollo 6, then Fairfax. Okay.
Okay, all right, let's come on up and.
Well, good evening, everyone. Really excited to be here tonight. Suzanne and I are excited to talk about the history of desegregating public libraries in Northern Virginia. Before we started, we wanted to give a shout out to Charlie Clark, who passed away last month. Suzanne and I encountered him several times in our careers as librarians, and he loved Arlington and he loved Arlington history. So tonight, this is for Charlie. So how did we come about giving a presentation and writing a book about the history of desegregating public libraries in the area? Well, it all began. Let's use a keyboard here. There we go. It all began in April 2021. Dr. Sujatha Hampton, who's pictured there in the top left, was recently appointed to the Library Board of Trustees for Fairfax County. And she is the third vice president of the Fairfax County chapter of the NAACP, and also the education chair for the county's NAACP chapter. At a library board retreat, she posed the question, were Fairfax County public libraries ever segregated? And if they weren't segregated, how is it possible that the Fairfax County public school system was? It doesn't really make sense. So this question was posed to our library director, Jessica Hudson, who's pictured there on the bottom left. And in turn, she sent an email to us in the Virginia Room. That's the email there on the top right. She wanted to know, were Fairfax County public libraries indeed ever segregated? And she also wanted us to look at what was going on at the surrounding Northern Virginia public libraries, Arlington included. So Suzanne and I embarked on this research project originally on work time, And it quickly became apparent that nobody had ever really looked at the history of segregated libraries in Northern Virginia, with the exception of Alexandria, which we'll get to in a moment. So it quickly became a passion project and a labor of love for the two of us. It's a little bit of background of how we did this research and wrote this book. So originally, we consulted our archives in the Virginia room, which has all of the library board minutes, the meeting minutes going all the way back to the 1940s. We looked at scrapbooks, we looked at bookmobile records, correspondence, all kinds of stuff. We also reached out to the community, longtime Fairfax County citizens and Northern Virginia citizens. We reached out to former librarians, people who used the library back in the 1950s and 60s to see what they remembered. And then we made some field trips. We went to the Library of Virginia, which has a lot of library records for the whole state, including Fairfax County and Arlington Public Library and Alexandria. And then we made some field trips to actual sites, libraries that were once segregated and still exist today. And then after about 8 months, we had to force ourselves to stop, and we wrote a 100-page report for our library board and gave a presentation to them. And once we did that, everyone said, you gotta write a book. So we wrote a book, and that's how we ended up with the book that we have today. So I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne, who's going to talk about why you're all here for Arlington.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out today during the holiday season to listen to this topic. So yes, we're kicking it off with Arlington since we're here in Arlington today. The County of Arlington, like many other counties that have large public library systems, started off with a lot of small community libraries that were started by women's groups or wealthy individuals who had a private collection and later wanted to donate it to the county. So there were several of these throughout the County of Arlington. And in 1936, 5 of them joined together to form the Arlington County Library Association. And the following year, in 1937, the county decided to make it a government department of libraries and fund it, and thus Arlington Public Library was born. However, all of these pre-existing libraries only served the white community. Therefore, in 1940, Black residents of Arlington decided to form their own library association to serve Black residents, and they called it the Holmes Library Association. They named it after Henry Louis Holmes, who I'll talk about in the next slide. And this is a copy of their constitution that you see, and it reads in part that any individual who is interested in the library may become a member by making it known and participating in the work of the organization. So this is something we noticed throughout our research, is that often when there was a library that was for Black residents, they didn't necessarily exclude people of other races. However, unfortunately, the same was not true of the whites-only libraries, many of which had in their founding documents that they were to serve white residents only. So let's see if the clicker is working. Oh, it is working now. Okay, great. So who was Henry Louis Holmes, who they decided to name the library after? Well, he was formerly enslaved. We believe he was born enslaved, but there's no proof of that. But he moved to the Freedmen's Village in Arlington during the Reconstruction era, and he became active in Reconstruction era politics and became Arlington's Commissioner of Revenue from 1877 to 1904. And he also was worked as a farmer and a laborer and bought a lot of land, which became the Butler Homes community and is now known as Penrose. So not really a specific connection to libraries, but he was a prominent Black citizen in Arlington. So they decided to name the library after him, and his portrait hung in the Holmes Library Association, which originally was just located in like couple of different church basements and so forth over the years, until in 1944, the Arlington Public Library partnered with the Holmes Library Association to make a separate library branch for Black residents and call it the Holmes Library. And it was located in the Carver Homes community, which is a community that was built for folks who were displaced when the Pentagon was built. So it was like lots of trailers and small homes, and it eventually evolved to be 8 multi-story buildings. And this little Holmes Library was built there in 1944 as part of Arlington Public Library system. So they finally had their own freestanding building. And they got some additional books, but it was still the smallest library by far in the system, with only about half as many books as the smallest library serving white residents. Nevertheless, it was well utilized, and you see the librarian there with some of the children in the community, and it was very convenient to folks who lived there. But in 1949, sadly, the government decided that they were going to sell this land, and so the library was going to have to be torn down. There's one bright spot to that part of the story, though, which is that some of the residents of the Carver Homes community formed two Black cooperatives, bought the land to preserve affordable housing for Black residents in Arlington. So that's a great piece of Black history there. They were the first Black cooperatives in the US. So that was kind of cool, but it was still sad for the library because they did tear the library down, and Arlington Public Library stored the books for a while, but they couldn't find another good place to build this branch again. So they just quietly integrated in 1950. So in January of 1950, they just decided all of the libraries were now open to everybody. Now, the problem with that was they didn't necessarily make the Black community make it known proactively to Black residents that, hey, you are now welcome to use any libraries in the county. On the contrary, the evidence that we do have shows from oral histories and so forth shows that Black residents at that time didn't really know that they had access to those libraries. Everything was so segregated. The schools were segregated in Arlington until 1959. The Park Service was segregated until the 60s. So there was really no way for people to, in 1950, to necessarily know that they were welcome in these libraries or feel comfortable in them if they had not been in the past, if they had been segregated in the past, which they were. So many Black residents of Arlington relied instead on the Huffman Boston High School, which had its own library. And this is the librarian, Mildred Johnson, who was the librarian for many decades there until, this is her picture from the 1962 yearbook. And so some of the oral histories we have indicate that, well, folks would just, Black residents would just use the high school library if they needed to get some books. And that's another recurring theme in our book, is that often some folks who didn't have access to public libraries would use school libraries. On the other hand, the public libraries often supplied the school libraries, so there was sort of this symbiotic relationship there. And let's take a look at what was happening in Alexandria, because very different story in Alexandria. As we know, it's another suburb of Washington, D.C., not too different from Arlington geographically or demographically, but very different story of how the libraries were integrated in Alexandria. This gentleman who you see here in his middle-aged years is Samuel Wilbert Tucker, and he was a young attorney who was born and raised in Alexandria. He was something of a prodigy. He attended, luckily they didn't have a high school for Black students at all in Alexandria, but luckily his family was able to send him to Washington, D.C. to get an education at Armstrong High School by using an address of some friends of theirs who lived in DC. And he graduated from Howard and then he went to Howard after that, graduated at 20, sat for the bar exam without ever having attended law school, and passed the bar exam at the age of 20 and had to wait till he was 21 to practice law because that was the law. So he was quite a brilliant guy, and he had born and raised in Alexandria. He opened his law practice in Alexandria. And at that time, he was still a young fellow in his 20s. And the beautiful Alexandria Library opened in 1937, just 2 blocks away from where he had his home and his law office. So naturally, he would like to use this beautiful library that is near his home, rather than having to go to DC to use the library, which is how he studied for the bar exam. He used DC Public and the Library of Congress, which were open to everybody. But why would you want to go into DC if you have a library next door? So he applied for a library account there and was turned away because of his race. The library's constitution said that only the library was for white residents, and folks that were not residents of Alexandria could pay to have a library card for $1.50 a year if you were white. However, Black residents, whether or not they were taxpayers and citizens of Alexandria, could not use that library. So naturally, Mr. Tucker was pretty incensed about this, and he decided to plan a twofold strategy that would involve a lawsuit and a sit-down strike, which, remember, this is 1939, by the way, 1939, so 2 years after the library opened, but still, 1939, a sit-down strike. It was one of the first sit-down strikes in the nation, sometimes referred to as America's first sit-down strike. But we have evidence that there was some auto, that he got the idea from some auto industry strikes where they did a sit-down type of situation. In any case, he trained these young fellows who you see in the photo on the right. They met several times and they sort of were trained in like civil disobedience, like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're not gonna talk back or whatever. But what they planned to do was one day in August in 1939, each of these young men was to enter the library and request to open an account. And each one was denied because of his race, whereupon he took a book off the shelf and sat quietly in the library reading the book. So this was the plan. And they were not to talk to anyone, not to do anything except to request to open the account, sit quietly in the library reading the book. So that's what happened. For this simple act and for refusing to leave, the police were called and the young men were escorted from the library. This Mr. Tucker had anticipated, so he had the press ready to record these events, and the press took these photos that we have today. And that was part of his strategy, was to raise attention to the injustice of denying Black citizens use of the library. However, Mr. Tucker himself did not participate in the sit-in because he wanted to be available in his capacity as a lawyer to defend the young men and protect them from having to serve time in jail. So unfortunately, this did not result in the desegregation of Alexandria's libraries. Instead, the city of Alexandria hastily built a separate library for Black residents, opened it less than a year later, and said, here you go, you can use this library. Well, as you can see, it's this very tiny library, very well utilized there during the story time with all of the children. However, much smaller than the library for white folks on Queen Street. Was open fewer hours. It had much older books that were discarded from the main library for the most part. So it was in no way equal to the library for white residents. And of course, this is a situation we see throughout the history of the segregated libraries, is the separate but unequal nature of these libraries. And that is one of the early librarians, Mrs. Carr, standing in front of the library that you see in one of the photos. So today, this library is a Black History Museum. You might ask, when did Alexandria finally integrate the libraries? Well, it was not until 1959 that they integrated for adults and high school students. And it was not until 1962 that they took the children's services from the Robinson Library and moved them into the main library and fully integrated the services for everybody. So you can still see the Robinson Library today. It's now a Black History Museum. And the library on Queen Street, which is where the sit-in took place, is also still there. And it now has signage commemorating the sit-in and the civil rights actions that took place there. So it's an interesting situation, I think, when you look at Arlington and Alexandria and how two cities that are suburbs of DC had such different stories when it came to the libraries integrating, and Alexandria not really integrating until a decade later after Arlington. Why was that the case? Well, the presence of a segregated branch actually allowed Alexandria to forestall integration much longer than Arlington. The state of Virginia had a law in the books as early as 1946 that said a library that is receiving state aid must be serving all residents. However, the language in the law was kind of vague. It didn't necessarily say that had to be equal service. So places that had a segregated library, or even maybe a bookmobile stop, could say, hey, well, we're serving all residents. But Arlington, when the Holmes Library closed, they no longer had any service for Black residents. So they just quietly integrated in recognition of the fact that they needed to be serving everyone. So that is a situation in a nutshell with Arlington and Alexandria. And we are going to go back to Chris and hear a little bit about Fairfax County.
All right, over to Fairfax County. So like Arlington, Fairfax County had a lot of pre-existing libraries, community libraries. The first one was opened in Herndon called the Herndon Fortnightly Library in 1889. There was one in Vienna. There was one in Forestville, which is Great Falls today. one in McLean, Falls Church, and then there was a Fairfax County Library established in 1929, but the county board of supervisors didn't want anything to do with it and didn't provide any funding, so they were kind of all on their own. Every single one of these libraries were segregated. They were only accessible to the white residents of the county. Fairfax County Public Library arrived on the scene in 1939. This was the first library building. It was this small cinder block building that was built behind the Fairfax County Courthouse. And if you were a resident of the county, you couldn't access this building. It only housed the book collection and the library staff. But what do you see there on the right? There's a garage. And inside the garage is where the bookmobile was housed. That was how the county residents got their books. It was a converted bus that was funded by the WPA, and it went around the county to different stops like schools and the existing community libraries that FCPL partnered with, as well as deposit stations. And that's how you got your books if you were a Fairfax County resident. In the beginning, 1939, they were trying to decide, should we provide service to Black residents as well? At the first Library Board of Trustees meeting, the date's kind of cut off there at the top there, but it notes that they decided that books allocated to white residents would be restricted to Black residents, and books available for Black residents would not be available to white residents. Essentially meant FCPL would have a segregated book collection. But it took a whole nother year before they actually decided to agree to provide service to Fairfax County's Black citizens. And you could see here in these snapshots from the library board minutes what they decided. So they did agree to offer service, and they would do it in bookmobile deposit stations. So this is a snapshot of a book circulation statistic and book deposit stations in Fairfax County. I think it's cut off at the top on the screen over here, but at the top, it's segregated. At the top, those left numbers on the two columns there are for the white residents of the county, and on the right there, that's 7-3 and 3-2 numbers. Those are the numbers for the Black residents. So if you were white and living in the county, you could access library books at existing community branches, at public schools, as well as you could actually go onto the bookmobile and check out a book. If you were Black and living in the county, you only had 2 book deposit stations. You couldn't actually go onto the bookmobile. It only visited a book deposit station in Falls Church and one in Fairfax. And unfortunately, we don't know the locations of where these were. We're still kind of researching that, but it's not mentioned in the minutes and any other surviving records that we have. But that was it. Those only 2 deposit stations was how you could access books if you were Black in the county. At one point, FCPL decided to stop Black service altogether in the mid-1940s, but eventually did restart in the 1950s and started actually going to the segregated schools and making book deposit stations there as well. In 1953, the library hired a new library director, and she was disgusted with how horrible FCPL was. The book collection was just subpar, service was terrible, and so less than 2 weeks on the job, she closed the whole system down for 6 months. When they reopened, they expanded the original cinder block library building into a bigger building, and also opened up the first library branch, which was the Thomas Jefferson branch. It was in this dentist, today it's a dentist, but at the time it was the family barber shop in the back there. And FCPL quietly desegregated in 1954 in January of that year. So while FCPL desegregated, some of the existing community libraries, such as the Vienna Town Library that you see here, did not desegregate, and they were very adamant about not desegregating. The Vienna Town Library was built in 1897, and their 1912 charter explicitly states that only the town's white inhabitants could use this library. It actually still exists today. That's a picture of it there, and it's got that cute little library that looks like the library there, and you could actually visit it. It is a museum today. One of the residents who couldn't use this library was William McKinley Carter. Carter was a lifelong resident of the town of Vienna. His family had lived in the area since 1842 in neighboring Freedom Hill, which is in the Vienna area. In the 1950s, shortly after he retired from a lengthy career for the IRS, a shocking incident occurred with his children and the Vienna Town Library. a white woman who wasn't aware of the segregationist policies of the Vienna Town Library checked out books for Carter's children, who were able to take them home with them and read them. Once the Vienna Town Library Board of Trustees found out that they had these books, they went to his house and demanded them back. This really irked Carter and his friends, which was a quote that actually his son said. We recollected that several years later. And the whole Vienna town community were really outraged by this. So what they did is, in Carter's living room, they formed a biracial organization called the Friends of the Vienna Library, with the hopes of courting FCPL to bring a branch to Vienna to replace the Vienna Town Library, since they were so set in their ways of not opening up to everyone. So this Friends group generated tremendous enthusiasm from the Vienna Town community. They needed $6,500 to open up a branch to help fund FCPL to open it, and they successfully did this. Now that's them signing the lease in the Vienna Shopping Center. This became the Patrick Henry branch of the library system, and that's actually William McKinley Carter in the back there. He was the treasurer of the group. Carter was later honored in 1968. In that library, they gave an honorary bookshelf. Any new book that was donated to the library went on the shelf, and that's him there in the middle. In 1971, the existing Patrick Henry Library replaced the storefront library, and Carter was instrumental in helping with that, and that's him there in the middle there at the grand opening of that branch. Today, in the Patrick Henry Library, there is a portrait of both him and his wife, and this library is actually about to be torn down, and there are community efforts to actually rename the library the Vienna Carter Library in honor of the Carters. So that's Vienna. Falls Church was another partnering community library with FCPL, even though it was in the town of Falls Church, which became the city of Falls Church. That library was established in 1899. Next year is its 125th anniversary. And there is a group called the Village Improvement Association that put together this library and put it in the backyard of the Mayor of Falls Church, George Hawkshurst's house. And that's it there, pictured on the left. We found that picture earlier this year. Nobody had ever seen that picture before in a newspaper. And like everywhere else, it was a segregated library. On the right there, after it partnered with the FCPL, you could see this is a circulation statistic information sheet, and it says from 1941 that it only provides service to the white residents. The bar registration statistics that are right below that circle there also has it segregated, and you could see only the white residents are recorded there because it only serves Falls Church's white residents. All that changed thanks to two men. One is this guy in the middle here with the basketball. That is Dr. E.B. Henderson. Henderson spent his entire life championing and fighting for civil rights. He was born in Washington, D.C., and in 1904, he became the first certified Black male instructor of physical education in this country when he accepted a job with D.C. Public Schools. That summer, he went to Harvard University's Summer School of Athletics, and he learned the new game of basketball from the people that James Naismith taught the game to. And James Naismith was the founder of basketball. So he took this game back with him to DC and taught his students, and today he's known as the grandfather of Black basketball. In 1909-1910, he staged the first all-Black basketball game in True Reformers Hall on U Street, which actually still exists today. It's not too far from the Washington Wizards Capital One Arena there, which is about to move to Alexandria, so I hear. And he ended up winning the World Color Basketball Championship that year. That was in December, and that was his last game of basketball that he ever played because the night before, he got married, and his wife asked him to stop playing basketball. And later that week, they moved to the town of Falls Church, and that's where they lived ever since. So Henderson actually started the first rural chapter of the NAACP in the country in 1918, and he was its treasurer.
And he never played basketball again.
He never played basketball again, but he coached and he taught his students. So in 1950, the spring of 1950, Falls Church Public Library, which was segregated, had a local authors night. Henderson had originally, a decade earlier, written the first book about Black athletics, which was called The Negro in Sports. It's there on the right there. And he recently republished in 1949 a newer edition of it. And so the library held its first ever local authors night and invited about 12 local authors, including Henderson, to speak and talk about their books. We don't know if Henderson accepted the invitation, but we know his book was on display there. And that's the first record we have of the Falls Church Library starting to engage with the Black community in Falls Church. However, the library still remained segregated, and it wasn't until 1955 when that changed. Henderson, along with Reverend Wallace Costner, who was the pastor of the Second Baptist Church, which still exists today in Falls Church, they got together and they put pressure on the library board to desegregate. This is a little snapshot from the library board minutes of the Falls Church Town Library, saying that board members would like to have Mrs. Elizabeth Graham pursue the matter of library service to Falls Church's Black population by contacting Reverend Costner and Mr. Henderson. So the three met and they discussed ways that they could make the libraries more accessible to the town's Black residents. And Mr. Henderson at the meeting actually gave some documents and historical records to the Falls Church History Room, which they still have today. And that's Elizabeth Graham there in the middle. She reported back and the library board voted to desegregate and open to everyone. In later years, which is now the Falls Church Public Library is known as the Mary Riley Stiles Library. It was kind of a nomad. It never really had a physical building. It was always kind of moving around. In 1958, they finally built a new permanent building, and Henderson was very instrumental in making sure that happened. And this is the visitor register from that event. You can see E.B. Henderson's signature there. There's a guest book on the right, and above it is his wife's name, Mary Henderson, who was a teacher for the Falls Church Public Schools. And Henderson is pictured there in the middle. When Falls Church Public Library held its first ever oral history nights, they invited Henderson to give recollections of what it was like to be in Falls Church in the 1890s, and that's him there smoking his pipe. Henderson has received tremendous acclamation and recognition in the last 2 years. The Washington Wizards 2 years ago named its philanthropic award after him. DC, University of District Columbia, which was Henderson's alma mater, renamed its athletic center after him. And this past summer, they actually dedicated a statue of him on the left there in August. He also has a historical marker that was put in front of his house in Falls Church, which still exists. And in February of next year, Henderson's grandson, E.B. Henderson II, is publishing a book called The Grandfather of Black Basketball, The Life and Times of Dr. E.B. Henderson. So might be somebody you might want to have for a future Arlington Historical Society program. He's a great speaker. Moving on to a little bit south, Prince William County. This is just one slide about Prince William. Prince William was the only library system to open desegregated in 1952. It was the first demonstration public library funded by the state to open in Virginia. And what that meant was the state library bought the bookmobile, bought the book collections, gave it to Prince William County. They got to operate it for a year. And they had to convince, the citizens had to convince the Board of Supervisors to fund the library. And if they did, they got to keep it. So they are the first to have opened desegregated. That's a great picture we have of school children using the bookmobile. Over to Suzanne, we'll wrap it up with Loudoun County.
I hope you enjoy looking at this photo of this beautiful family, because Chris and I were so thrilled to find a photo of the Murray family in the photo archives of the Thomas Balch Library in Leesburg. We really wanted to be able to show them to you because they were so instrumental in desegregating the library in Loudoun counties. The Percival Public Library, which was the only public library in Loudoun County at the time. So Samuel Cardoza Murray and Josie Cook Murray were a couple who owned an upholstery shop in Percival, and they were very well respected for the quality of their work. They had many prominent citizens who used them for upholstery work, window treatments, building furniture, any kind of decor type of work. They had their own upholstery shop in Percival. And they, in 1956, they received a commission from President Eisenhower's sister-in-law to make some Austrian-style draperies for her home in Hillsborough. That's how well known and respected they were. So they weren't familiar with this particular type of drapery. So they went to the public library in Percival, which was the only public library in Loudoun County at the time, to do some research on this particular style. And they were not permitted to check out a book because of their race. So they decided to take legal action. Mr. Murray said, if I didn't pay my taxes, they would take my home. Since I do pay my taxes, I feel like I should have the right to use a book from the library, which is paid for by my taxes. Now I told you about that 1946 law in the state of Virginia stating that the library receiving state funds must be serving all residents. Well, Percival not only was not allowing Black residents to use the main building, but they also did not even have a bookmobile stop for the Black community. So they were not providing any kind of service for Black residents. So they were clearly not abiding by the law. So you would think that this would be an open and shut case. But the Murrays had trouble getting a lawyer to represent them because a lot of lawyers did not want to be involved in a civil rights case in 1957. So eventually, though, Mr. Oliver Stone in Alexandria agreed to take on the case, and he applied pressure to the library board to be in alignment with this law and open up the library to all residents. The library board had to concede that they were not in compliance with the law, so they capitulated and agreed to become integrated. However, the segregationists in Loudoun County, calling themselves defenders of state sovereignty and individual liberty, decided they would fight to close the library or move it to private ownership to avoid integrating it. And so they put up a fight, and they tried to get the Board of Supervisors to not allow these funds to go through to fund the library, because that would involve desegregating the library. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful, and the Board of Supervisors, although narrowly, with much drama, including 2 of the tie-breaking voters calling in sick at the last minute, but they did vote to fund the library in 1957, and the Loudoun County Public Library became the first integrated public facility in Loudoun County. So it was a great victory for the civil rights movement in Loudoun County, thanks to these fine people here. Now, the Percival Library still exists as part of the Loudoun County Public Library, so you can check it out if you're in Loudoun. And over there on the left, you see those curtains. Those are the Austrian-style draperies that the Murrays made for Mrs. Moore when the Eisenhowers went to visit Mrs. Moore, because Mrs. Moore was Mamie Eisenhower's sister. They went to visit, and they were so impressed with these very stylish draperies in the house that they asked the Murrays to do draperies and other furnishings for their house in Gettysburg. So if you go to the Eisenhower National Historic Site in Gettysburg, you will see these fashionable Austrian-style draperies in nearly every room of the house. Furthermore, the Eisenhowers then asked the Murrays to do curtains for the White House as well. And Mrs. Murray's niece has collaborated on a children's book about that called Opening Closed Doors, The Life of Josie Murray. So in conclusion, we would just like to let you know a little bit more about our book. Our book also includes a chapter about elsewhere in Virginia. So we cover Danville, Petersburg, Portsmouth, other parts of Virginia for context. So you can compare what was going on in Northern Virginia to what was going on in other parts of Virginia. We have a chapter about Washington, D.C., because it was such a vital resource for Northern Virginia scholars like Mr. Tucker or Mr. Henderson, who were able to take advantage of some of the resources in Washington, D.C. We go into some critical analysis of implicit segregation versus explicit segregation. I mentioned Danville, just briefly tell you an example of implicit segregation. So in Danville, the public library was compelled to integrate in 1960, but when they opened as an integrated facility, they had removed all the tables and chairs in the library so that Black people could not sit at the same tables as white people. And they had also added a 4-page long library application asking all kinds of nosy questions like, what's your education level, and why do you want to use the library, and what hours do you think you might use the library, and this kind of thing. And you had to have 2 references. So just an example of how, yes, they were desegregated, but it was still sort of implicitly segregated or unfriendly environment for folks. So we also go into, as I mentioned, the schools versus the public libraries. There's over 100 photos in the book, most of which have never been published before. And much of the research in the book has never been published before. It's derived from local archives. So yeah, we do actually have copies of the books available today, and Chris and I are donating our author proceeds to the Fairfax County NAACP in recognition of all the work that the NAACP did to support these library activists who are great Virginian citizens who fought to open the libraries to all people. And we hope that's the inspiring aspect of our book, is that we hope to draw more attention to some of our great Virginian citizens who took it upon themselves to make public resources more accessible for everyone. And with that, I will ask if there's any questions that we can answer.
I have a question, and you'll need to repeat what I say into the mic. So you talked about some of the pushback from other counties. In Arlington, was there pushback when people started to suddenly see African Americans in the library?
Not that we know of. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was that there is that in some of these situations we see that there was pushback when the libraries became desegregated. And was that the case in Arlington? Was there any pushback when the libraries became integrated? None of the oral histories that we've collected indicated that that doesn't mean it didn't happen, but just that we didn't find any. There's no evidence that we know of about that. But often when we speak to groups like this, we have folks, especially older folks who were alive back then, who stand up and tell us about what they went through, and we learn things. So we're still learning. We're always interested in adding to this research and learning more. So if anyone has experiences that they want to let us know about, please reach out to us at the Fairfax County Public Library and let us know. Any other questions in the room? Yes.
What was the history of law in 1947 mandated all the residents have access to libraries? Could we understand the history of how that in the past?
Oh, the question is, do we know, so when the Code of Virginia stated in 1946 that all libraries receiving state aid should serve all residents, do we know how that came about? Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we really know much about the background of that law. We just, I did want to mention, though, that in 1939, when Mr. Tucker was having his sit-in Alexandria, that was when the American Library Association came out with its Bill of Rights, stating, the rights that people had to the library, and yet nobody came to the defense of Mr. Tucker. So it wasn't until 1960 that the American Library Association changed the Bill of Rights to include the right of people of all races to use the library. So yeah, so unfortunately we don't know the answer to that, but that's a really good question, and maybe we can find out. We're still doing research. We're still learning more. We actually had to shorten the book because they wanted us to keep the book down to about 200 pages. So we had to leave out some of what we did have, but there's even so much more that can be, is out there waiting for more people to do the research and discover. Did you have anything to add, Chris?
No.
To either of those?
Other than, I was gonna say, yeah, that's really fascinating about like how did the 1946 law come to be? Like that's something like,
It seems like that's
yeah. Like I'd be interested in like the discussion on how that came about. If there's like minutes or a congressional something in the reports or something like that. The state Congress. Yeah, I'm gonna go look that up.
Yeah.
So let's ask Marty if he has from Zoom. So Marty, do you have any questions from your Zoom watchers?
We have only one unanswered question, although I think it was answered, but I'll repeat it. When did Arlington actually end up allowing Black residents to use the libraries without any difficulty?
So beginning in January of 1950, they all residents, it was in writing that all residents had access to all libraries. So at that point, any citizen of Arlington should have been able to use any library, and we don't have any evidence that that wasn't the case, other than that we have the oral histories of some Black residents saying that they didn't know that they had access because they just hadn't been proactively invited to come and use the libraries. So. Or that, and also that, you know, as was often the case, and I have the quote on the screen here, when you know you're not wanted somewhere, you just don't feel comfortable going in. That's what segregation does. That's a quote from Gertrude Evans, who was involved in desegregating the movie theaters in Leesburg, but also very indicative of the situation as a whole. If the library had formerly been whites only, would Black residents feel comfortable going in there to use it, even if they knew that it had been desegregated? In many cases, we have the statistics showing that even after many of these whites only libraries were desegregated, there were very few Black residents that came in to use them. And many of them continued to use the segregated libraries for Black residents, probably just because they felt more comfortable there and knew that they would be welcome there. So yeah, anything else? Any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.